Well, you are familiar with the geography of the situation of the subject matter, perhaps. Just very briefly, here is Turkey, here is Soviet Armenia, and this eastern part of Turkey is known as Western Armenia, because for centuries it was Armenia until the Seljuks and 11th century and so on. This is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus, and so on. So most of the churches that I will show slides of are located in Soviet Armenia, and of course many in Western Armenia or Eastern Turkey. Mount Ararat happens to be here, which is part of historical Armenia. I thought before I start, I'd like to I'll show the slides very quickly, just about 12 or 20 of them, so that you get an idea about the architecture I'm talking about. Then I'll go back to it and explain it individually.
Okay.
I brought quite a few books here, which you can browse through at the end of the presentation. Well, this is Mount Ararat, which is the symbol of Armenia. It's in eastern Turkey, and I understand in this Search of Noah's Ark, which is a movie, they are claiming that Mount Ararat, Echmiadzin, which is the see, or like the papal see of the Armenian Church, and Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia, is part of eastern Turkey, which is the greatest, furthest thing from the truth. And I want to straighten that out. Beg your pardon?
I just don't we wish.
Yes, but I can see them claiming that Mount Ararat is in eastern Turkey, which it is now. But Yerevan and Echmiadzin have never been in Turkey. So for some reason, the makers of this film would like to make, perhaps because they would not let Americans go to Mount Ararat and take pictures of it unless they claimed it to be Turkish. Okay. Here we got some. Oh, just we'll be okay. This is a compilation of the different types of churches, plans, drawn at the same scale, so that you can see from the left top down, second row, third row, fourth row. They are in chronological order. In other words, from the beginning of Armenian architecture, dating back to before Christian era, and onwards toward the 13th or 14th century, to the bottom right, which are monastic ensembles or complexes. Well, again, I'll explain to them to you later, but I wanted to have a quick impression of the plan view shapes of the different churches. I'm going to come back. I just want to have a very quick glimpse of the type of architecture we're talking about. Go back to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. I think that's sufficient. Now, can we have the lights on for a minute, please?
You have the church in Iran there.
Beg your pardon?
You have the church in Iran.
Yes, we do, yes.
Because my neighbor friend saw it when she was in Iran last year.
Right.
And she told me about it. It's the only Christian church in Iran, and
That's
I
right.
guess it's a focal point for visitors. and
Right.
tourists.
It's a tourist attraction. In fact, the tourist office of Iran has a big poster of that church, and I have it.
Oh, good. We just talked about it yesterday.
Yes, I have a plan of it, but
Her daughter and her son-in-law lived in Iran for 2 years. They'll know about it. They have stories about Iran. And
Yes, it is a monastery,
is?
Armenian church monastery, where people go for an annual pilgrimage, and now the Iranians are making it a focal point for tourists as well. Again, they don't give much credit to it being an Armenian. It doesn't matter, does it? Okay.
Can't win.
No. I'll be very brief. I don't want to be highly technical, but first, have you gone over through the history of Armenia? I mean, how?
Briefly, Gina.
I will just in very summary form go about the dates, periods of Armenian history. It dates back to 3000 BC, about 2000 BC. The Hittites occupied the land of Armenia, or eastern Turkey now. And about 1700 BC, we had the Urartians, which are the direct predecessors of Armenians. And then about 1200 BC, Phrygian invasion came from northwest, and Urartian Empire declined about 700 BC, and then the Darius I of Persia invaded eastern Turkey. Now, I should never mention because at that time there was no Turkey, Western Armenia, about 6th century BC. About the 5th century, 401, we have the historian Xenophon traveling through Armenia and reporting about it. About 331 BC, Alexander the Great went through Armenia. And about 95 BC, we had our greatest era in empire building, so to speak. We had our great king Tigranes II, or Dikran, who came and spoiled down Syria, occupied Syria, and most of present-day Turkey and part of Iran. Then, of course, the 301 AD is a very important date for Armenians because nationally they accepted Christianity. In other words, it became the official church of the nation, for being the first nation to accept Christianity. And then, of course, they start building churches. And at 634 AD, we had the Arab invasion of the caliphs, which lasted a century and a half. Then we had the next great invasion of the Seljuk Turks in 1045, and then we had the Arp Aslan invading in 1064, and that almost put an end to Armenia historically. From there on, we had no independent Armenia. Armenia became a vassal country between Persia and Turkey, and for the last 6 centuries it has been part of Turkey, and until 1915, when they were massacred and dispersed all over the world. That's the brief history of Armenians. I have here a map of Armenia showing, fortunately for us, there are many Armenian monuments or ancient churches all over today's Soviet Armenia, which the government officially and methodically is reconstructing. They're going one by one and spending vast fortunes of money to rebuild them and to bring them to the original state. Those other churches that are in eastern Turkey, unfortunately, are systematically being destroyed, except a few that are very obvious to the tourists and foreign travelers, which they cannot. But for instance, I will show you some churches not far from today's Armenian borders, which were deliberately dynamited. Complex of 5 churches, and we have a few walls of 1 church remaining. We have many travelers who go there. In fact, there is a group of architects going there incognito, trying to record all the churches that are existent in mountainous districts of eastern Turkey, taking pictures, recording elevations, plans for interest of archaeologists and historians and architects. So, I don't think I will use my notes, since perhaps it would be more interesting seeing slides. But historically, I'd like to divide the development of Armenian architecture into 3 eras. As you know, in 301 AD, we accepted Christianity as a nation, and without going to history of church, the Armenian church is a national church. It's not part of any other church. It doesn't belong to the Catholic papacy or to even the Orthodox. It's a national Orthodox church. There were, as you know, councils of these early Christian leaders. There's that one of Chalcedon and Nicene and so on. Historians would be interested in that. All I would like to tell you is that in about 5th century, Armenians decided that they were an independent nation. They wanted to stick with their Nicene Creed of, I think, 451 AD. I don't know when it was exact date. And that they would have nothing to do with the other Eastern Orthodox churches or the Western Church. And from there on, they were independent. However, at that time, until the 6th century, the fathers of the Armenian Church determined that there was one way of building churches. Remember, they were a young national church. They had to, in many instances, raise all the pagan temples that preceded Christianity in Armenia. And on the same site, they built Armenian churches, Orthodox churches. But the leaders of the Armenian church would dictate to the architects the type of church they would build. And the type of churches they had to build is what we call the basilican style. The basilican style in plan is rectangular. And the basilican style of building was known in Pompeii, as early as in Pompeii, where we have usually a central nave, wider nave, and two narrow aisles on either side. In section, it would be thus, and there would be columns there, and usually light would turn to here. Now, the Armenians did the same thing, except their churches would be this way, and there would be no light. They always tried to produce an air of mysticism in their church. Now, that's the few early churches that we find as late as, as early as 5th century, remains of these churches. Then the next type of church that evolved in Armenia was what we call centralized. In other words, it's either in form geometry, it has a center, and it's either an octagon, hexagon, pentagon, you name it, cross. And most of the Armenian churches do belong to this, to the development of this type. But going back to the history of the development, therefore, we have three periods. The first one is from the 5th to the 7th centuries. And as in literature, in Armenian literature, if someone else did speak about that, we had our golden age in the 5th century. We had our great writers, poets, and so on, following the development of the Armenian alphabet. From the 5th to 7th century, we have, I can say again, the golden age of Armenian architecture. Now, remember in the 650s, the Arabs came and conquered Armenia. And Lake Van, which I had on the map I erased, it was the center of Armenian principality then, and the Arabs conquered it, and for about a century and a half, there was absolutely no building going on. Obviously, the Arabs were Muslims, the Armenians were Christians, and in the Middle East, there isn't much of tolerance, one religion against the other, and therefore Armenians, as a subject people belonging to a different religion, were prevented from building ecclesiastical buildings, church buildings. Therefore, for a century and a half, we don't see any building of church architecture. Then the second period starts from the 9th to the 11th century. Therefore, there are a century and a half, or let's say two for numerically. From 5th to 7th is the first period, and from 7th to 9th there is no activity. From the 9th to the 11th is the second phase of development. And that's because the Arabs with the pulling back of the Arab forces and semi-independence of Armenians and the establishment of the Baghrati or Bagraduni kingdom in Van, we had another surge in architectural development from the 9th to the 11th. Then, of course, in 1040 and so, we had the Seljuks come and raise capital of Armenia, Ani, along with its population. And we see again darkness and no activity of any sort until the 13th century, when we had a Zakarian, a family of princes who got some sort of sovereignty of their own with an understanding between Byzantium and Persia. And there's a brief period of 50 to 60 years of, again, activity. And darkness again, with Arpaslan's coming, and very, very little development until the 17th century. And of course, from there on, the Turkish subjugation became more intense, and Armenians were almost Turkicized. In fact, there are many cities in eastern Turkey or western Armenia where Armenians were prohibited from using their mother tongue or going to Armenian schools. My father was one of them. My father did not know any Armenian until he was 40 years old. He was born in Tarsus, where St. Paul was born, southern tip of Cilicia. And but my mother, being from another town, knew Armenian very well. And when they got married, my mother taught him, and my father eventually was a minister. He preached in Turkish because they were not permitted to use the national tongue. In any case, in many areas of Western Armenia, not only building of Armenian churches, but using their tongue, national native language, and going to Armenian schools was prohibited. This is also being witnessed now to a minor degree in some of the Arab countries, where nationalism is at its peak, where they prevent other ethnic groups like Armenians and Jews. Jews, that's another problem because of the Israeli situation. But even Armenians cannot have their church-related schools, for instance, like the school that you will take your friends to. Most of the schools in Syria and Lebanon, Armenian schools, are church-related. They are parochial schools, but they're having more and more difficulty teaching Armenian to the kids. They have to do everything in Arabic. Okay, now I just gave you a summary, historical summary, and I want to stress this point very strongly, that architectural development in Armenia has been directly linked to the degree of dependence or independence that we have enjoyed nationally as a group of people. It's very unfortunate that we have not had a steady growth and period of freedom in developing our talents. Imagine that here we are building office buildings with steel and concrete, and for 2 centuries nothing has to be done, and then no architectural schools and no magazines, and buildings have deteriorated or have been torn down or ruined, dynamited. And then 2 centuries later, the same people will try to build anew with nothing at hand except their memories and some ruined buildings. And this has been the story of Armenian architecture. Now, going to the technical, which I will not, when I say technical, just diagrammatical, I should say, because, let's discuss the materials they use, materials. We use, this building is obviously acoustical tile and studs and plaster. We are in California, we have wood construction. In eastern United States, we use a lot of brick, perhaps. In Turkey, they use mud, concrete in the Middle Eastern countries, concrete block and so on. So the material used mostly in Armenia has been stone. It's a stone that's called tuf. It's a basaltic stone. It's not very dense. It's lighter than granite, of course, and it comes in shades of pink to brown, and it's easy to manipulate and shape, and it weathers very well. So it's an ideal piece of stone for any mason, and that's very abundant in Armenia. We have plenty of it. In fact, Armenia is known as the land of rocks because it's very mountainous, and the people are very mountainous, and this is fortunately very much abundant for building. And in section, a typical wall of an Armenian church dating back to the 4th or 5th century is about 3 feet wide, this thick. The facing is about 10 inches on each side. Pieces of stones that vary in shape. They are mostly rectangular or square, not irregular. And they are very highly polished and smooth on the outside. This is a cross section now. And inside we have the rubble or concrete filling, the composition of which is subject to argument and discussion. Different authorities vary on what went into that rubble. But we know that when after earthquakes or willful ruination of these buildings, in many instances the spacings have come down partially or completely, and the rubble stands up there. That means that the strength of the walls was not in the stone, but in the concrete steel. There was no steel, obviously. Los Angeles City Building Code does not allow any kind of stone wall without any steel in it. In other words, they never give any value to brick. If you have a brick wall, it's not the brick that will hold up the roof, it's what goes inside, the concrete and the steel. Okay, so that's the material. Now, as I said, going back historically, the first churches were basilican style, long rectangular, which was used in early Christian churches because it was a form derived from early pagan temples. The Armenians came and put a dome on top, in the center, and put an apse or a niche on the east side because the altar had to always face east, the entrance being from the west, north being here. And therefore, the church, here we are, the Basilican style church. This is a similar church, but with these usually use wood trusses or wood frame. Later on, the Romans used, I said early Christians in the West, not in Armenia, used the same idea, but barrel. This is a barrel. Barrel-shaped vault roofs, and Armenians did add this to make it a Christian Armenian church. All right, then, when Armenians in the 5th century, architects in the 5th century, start developing what we call a dome over a square. And this dome over a square was not an invention of the Armenians. Very primitive homes have been built with the concept of having a square room of 4 walls. This is a plan view again, and putting what we call corbelling, beams across, one over the other, so that crisscross, it comes this way, then you have an opening at the top through which light and air comes, there being no windows in the walls. Now in Korea, there have been homes like this, in Persia, and apparently this system of building was quite common in Persia, and earlier there have been many homes with wooden members here, and eventually Persians used brick to have this dome over a square plan. And Syrians and early Christian Syrians, remember that perhaps most of the followers of Christ were in Syria, the then known Syria. before they went to other countries and preached. And Armenia supposedly got its two early preachers in the name of Papius and Bartholomew, followers of Christ, who were instrumental in converting the Armenian king into Christianity, who proclaimed later on through his descendant nation, Christian nation. Okay, so if I were to make an isometric plan, if this is a square building, therefore this is a dome, right, sitting over it. There was a problem of taking a square plan and having a dome and just say, okay, here is a square church, and obviously it wouldn't work. They had to have an altar. But the greatest problem was that this dome in section, let's say this is the dome, thrust a lot of weight and pressure downwards and outwards. In other words, these walls could not, to be able to withstand the thrust of the dome, had to be perhaps 6-7 feet thick. Otherwise, they would, fall back. So architects started using the idea of what we call niche buttresses. Projections outward from the square shape, one being the altar, one being the entrance, and these two being, let's say, additional chapels, small chapels where people go and light candles and pray to their God or their saints. So these, and of course, this is in various diagrammatic, you have the walls around it, and often these walls were polygonal. And therefore you see many plans in this manner, as I show you the slides. Okay, so the dome sits here, and the transition of the dome, the circular base of the dome, to the square plan is again done through a system which we call squinches or pendentives. I'll be able to point out a few in the slides where I have interior shots. Okay, now the mass of this, the apses or the niches act as a counterbalance to the thrust, downward and outward thrust of the weight of the dome. So it was both a aesthetic, functional, as well as a structural need to evolve into this sort of a plan. Now, this is a centralized plan of a square plan with the apses where we see the corners of the square on the outside. Now, another type which developed was this, where you had the apses joining each other at the corner of the square and not seeing the corners of the square protruding out. Then, of course, we had the many-sided churches, 5, 6, 8, where we have all these niches, and of course the walls are taking in polygonal shapes. And we call it quatrefoil or trefoil, depending how many apses these churches had. The later development, okay, now at this point we have already reached the 7th century. Most of the Armenian churches from the 5th to the 7th century were centralized plans in its many variants, which you'll see slides in a little while. From the 9th to 11th century, when they started again building, basically they copied their past achievements, except they refined the aesthetic proportions, and the scale of the buildings changed. If a building on the same base of, let's say, 50 feet across was in profile 50 foot high, they became higher in proportion. And the additional element that was introduced in the second period of architectural development was the decorative elements that were introduced. We had arcades on the outside of the building that were highly decorative. And third element that was introduced in the second period was introduction of sculpture, relief sculpture. We have a church called Aftamar in Lake Van, which was built in the 10th century, which many historians claim a similar edifice of that sort is not found to the east or west of that particular edifice. It's completely decorated. I mean, in Christian architecture. We have quite a few in India. You've seen Indian masterpieces. So that in the third period, the majority of the buildings were monasteries. Now, the Armenians finally realized that, my God, everybody's coming and raising them to the ground. Their buildings, their people are being massacred. They may do something about. They should do something about, saving their culture that belong to people. So they built monasteries in very remote areas, very uneasily accessible locations, usually on mountain tops, right by the ravine. So there would be one exit, there would be all kinds of walls around these complexes. So they had a church, let's say, and they would have a library, they would have a prayer room, jamadun we call it, and then they had rooms for the monks, as I said, library, and all the complex was surrounded by walls. And they have probably 20, 30, 40, 50 of these in Western Turkey now, Eastern Turkey now, and also some in Armenia. And these were used as depositories of their manuscripts, which the monks copied. They had all their scientists there of that period, and writers and so on. And in time of war, at least they could withstand the hordes coming and attacking if it was not on a large scale. And the people around the monastery from the villages would come up there and shelter themselves. So in the third period, which was from the 12th and 13th century on until the 17th, we see development of monastic complexes. And from there on, there has been no significant building of churches. But I'd like to mention one more development in the second period, which I failed to. Besides the centralized plans that I said was the predominant form in the first period, in the second phase, one basic shape of architectural development that took place was the following. They had basically a rectangular plan, but they call this the whole dome hall. They have a hall and then a dome over it. They have four clusters of columns here which carry the dome. And there are small arches from these columns to the wall itself where we have pilasters, thick pilasters. So that the weight of the dome is transferred through that arch to these pilasters in the wall, instead of having niches, as I explained earlier. So that the space inside the church is completely open. There are no columns intervening between the viewer and the altar, because they are very close. Now, an example of this is the church cathedral of Ani, which is of the 11th century. We see pictures of that. And historians have found traces of early Gothic architecture in the development of the vaults, ribbed vaults, and columns, which are very fluted. In other words, this is an example, was an example of, or was a precursor of Gothic architecture, according to historians. Now, I'll mention just a few names of writers about Armenian architecture. The most famous is a gentleman called Joseph Stritskovsky. He's Austrian, who, latter part of the last century and early part of this century, wrote extensively about Armenian architecture and early Christian art in German. We have one book that's translated in English. It's about early Christian art, which is mostly about Armenian architecture and art. And he must have Armenian ancestry, because he claims that Christian art was derived from Armenia. In other words, everything emanated from east to west, rather than from west to east. Prior to that, many historians claimed that the source of Christian art was Rome. He states the opposite. He states that Christian art came from the east, came from Armenia and also from Syria. And he thinks, and he's proving it through excavations and buildings which were unknown to historians. Because these churches that many slides, which you'll see, are really in very inaccessible areas in western Armenia. And historians never went that far, or archaeologists, to discover treasures of Christian art in the east. They came as far as Byzantium or Constantinople and stopped there. Now, Skovsky claims that even architecture of the Byzantine Empire was influenced. In fact, many of its, he states that the St. Sophia Cathedral, which is a mosque now, its dome was inspired by, Armenian church architecture, and so on and so forth. We will not go into that because there are those who also oppose that view. But that view is taking more and more acceptance in architecture historical circles, because the number of writers are increasing who are adhering to that view. It was new when he came into the scene, but now they are accepting it, and in the Encyclopedia Britannica and elsewhere you see always references to Armenian church architecture being the originator of many forms of Christian art. Let me just read a few here, since I did not follow my notes. According to him, Skovsky, Armenian art was a promoter of Christian art. According to him, Hagia Sophia of Istanbul, St. Vitalia of Ravenna, St. Peter's of Rome, and others were influenced by Armenian architecture. The chapel of Aix-la-Chapelle in France, founded by Charlemagne, the architect was Odo. He was from Messina, and he was of Armenian origin. Leonardo da Vinci, according to Skovsky, visited Yerevan and Armenia and brought back a large number of sketches of circular domed churches. Of course, Armenians went, after the dispersion of Ani in the 11th century and the 14th century, all over the world, through the Black Sea and to the Balkans, many of them to Moldavia, Poland. There was a big settlement of Armenians, about 300,000 Armenians in Poland from the 14th, 15th century on. In fact, there's a town called Lvov in Poland, which was totally inhabited by Armenians. There are Armenian churches there, which, of course, the Armenians eventually became Catholics and lost their identity. But the Kilin, which is very famous in Poland, was brought there by Armenians in their transfer of habitat. I met an architect about 10 years ago. He was Polish, and I introduced myself as Hrant Agbabian. IAN is an Armenian name. And he said, "Oh, you're Armenian?" I said, "Yes." He said he was Armenian. I said, "What? You're Polish?" And he said, "No, his four forefathers came from Armenia. He knew that much, that's all," as an example. About a few months ago, there was a big ad in the Los Angeles Times home section by the Spanish tourist office. There was this big castle, and on top of the castle, castle, I don't know, like this, and there is, the walls have these projections. Well, the whole castle was in that manner, but way on top, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was this very typical Armenian church, with a dome on top of this castle. Out of nowhere, the two types of architecture had nothing to do with each other, incongruent, in fact. And I wrote to the Spanish Opera, in New York. I said, I'd like to know the name of this castle. And they returned, my request by sending me more information about Spain. They never said where the castle was. But 2 years ago, I was giving a lecture, more detailed lecture, where I had more time. There was a professor from the Northridge School, Cal State, Northridge, is there such a place? I have his name and so on. He came to me after the lecture. He said that he gave me information. He verified my statement that Armenians had gone as far back as Spain and France through their migrations, not only because of persecutions, but also as merchants, They were good merchants. From Cilicia, southern Turkey or southern Armenia, they would go through the Mediterranean to Venice. And in fact, in Venice, we have a great center of Armenian studies by the Mechitaris Catholics, Armenian Catholics, and then to France and Spain. And he gave me examples of Spanish Catholic churches where the architects were Armenians, and you can see distinct Armenian architectural motifs and styles. Armenian architects, of course, went to Egypt, and I have here in a book about Turkish architecture in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says the minarets were derived from those of Persia. In addition to Syrian influence, Armenian masons undoubtedly played an important part, and there can be little doubt that the many circular and octagonal mausoleums domed internally but covered by a cone externally were influenced by the kumpet, the dome, this conical dome of the Armenian churches. Then about Egyptian architecture, in the book called Western Islamic Architecture by John Hall, we read the following. Weakened by the economic troubles of the mid-century, this is the 12th century, the Fatimid caliphs, like the Sunni rivals in Baghdad, began to be menaced by the Turkish slave guards. To offset this menace, the Fatimid al-Mustansir, this gentleman, in 1073, called in the Armenian general Badr al-Gamali. In 1087, Badr al-Gamali strengthened and extended the walls of Cairo, replacing the mud brick with some of the finest masonry ever erected. The Bab al-Fatah, which is a gate, I've seen that 2 years ago, is one of the gates designed for Badr by 3 Armenian brothers and architects who were architects from Urfa in eastern Turkey. Well, I'm not trying to suggest to you that Armenians propagated their architecture all over the world. It just happens to be a historical fact that because of persecutions and history, they were dispersed. Why do you think we are here? Or, of course, many people have come to the United States, not by choice, but because in their own countries there was famine and things were not good. They came to this new world of which we are very proud and we contribute to. But before coming to the States, let's say it has a history of a few hundred years, Armenians were one of those unfortunate people who were very Western in their outlook, but lived in the East. They were surrounded by people who would not tolerate them, and they were too obstinate to change their religion. They could have become Muslims and lived happily ever after, but they would, I think, have been would have lost their heritage and their literature, their language, their music, their architecture. They were obstinate and they stuck with their religion. And even though I'm not suggesting that religion is salvation of mankind in art, but obviously in history of Armenians, the fact that they stayed Christians, they maintained their culture as we know it today. Perhaps if we were not Christians and stayed as Armenians, we would have another kind of art to give to the world. But for the last 17 centuries, it's because of the Armenian Church that Armenians have been able to develop as a nation and as a cultural group and contribute to whatever extent they have. I'm going to show slides and maybe say a few more things. I depart completely from my notes because I feel that you are more interested in looking at the slide. We'll tell you more. Someday when we want to be more technical, I can show you plans, sections. But I invite you to look through these books. Before you put out the light, can you please wait a second? The quality of the books are fantastic. These are colored pictures of khachkars, Armenian cross stones, which I'll talk about. This book here, for instance, is about Armenian monuments all over, and with plans and pictures, and in English.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
About the churches you have here now?
Yes.
Do they follow some of these architectures?
Yes, I will.
I'm going to look at it.
Yes, they certainly do. And these are books about individual monasteries or churches. It's printed in Italy. Yes, you can if you wish.
I'll take it.
Thank you. You can put the light on. Those books, I have about 9 of the series of 9. They are put out by Institute of Architecture in Milan and a group of Armenian architects in Soviet Armenia. They methodically go and measure each piece of stone on a wall, and you see the elevations. I mean, it's not just a picture and elevation. Every piece of stone is to scale, sections, plans, interior shots, and so on, so that in case they are ruined through earthquake, that's an earthquake country, or through further destruction by the Turks, we'll have a record of it. Okay. I have to put this on. But people think that this church was by Mount Ararat, and Mount Ararat being the resting place of Noah's Ark, and Christians being so interested, people who went to Armenia searching Noah's Ark or trying to find traces came back showing that church with the Noah's Ark landing on Mount Ararat, and it's an ancient church. Okay, these are some of the capitals of the columns. And some of the columns itself. Very dark hued stones. There's an eagle capital. The decorative elements in the early period church architecture did not include animals. They include only floral and fruits, grape clusters and so on. You see in the background that rubble or concrete filling of the stone. This is another church in Armenia of the 7th century. The front part with the kind of curvy domes is a later addition which shows Islamic influence. But the church itself, the original church, is to the back of it. This is Lake Sevan in Armenia, which is a very beautiful place. And that little chapel is of the 10th century. Here you can see the stone roof being very smoothly dressed, but apparently after earthquakes or some problem, they rebuilt the walls. The peasants around did a very good job. The upper dome is done in its original state, but somehow these walls were added on. And if you meet any Armenian, since you are going to an Armenian church someday, you will see the priest perhaps wearing a cap in the shape of this stone. Armenian priests have, we call it verar, in the shape of this stone. Here's the same church. And from the lake, I took this shot because these are artists, not hideout, but, vacation homes. As you know, in Soviet countries, artists are venerated much more than doctors are. In other words, the people who make the most money there are artists, and they get the most privileges, musicians, writers, and so on. and they have such places all over the country. And these are two of those, and to them I showed the contrast between contemporary, so-called contemporary architecture and the ancient one. This is Lake Van in western Armenia, which is now eastern Turkey, and on it is this famous, very famous Armenian church called Atkamar I talked about, with decorative friezes all around it. Here are cross sections and the plan. The dark plan is the original church, and then later on they added other usage around it. This is the plan. Again, it's a square plan, but the apses touch each other at the corner, with, in this case, the corner diagonal niches protruding out. And the whole building is surrounded, I should say, it's decorated with friezes from scenes from the Bible, New and Old Testament, and national life, fruits, berries. I'll show a lot of those slides to you. This belfry in the front on the west side was added again in the 17th century. Somehow they went through a period of adding belfries in the 17th century, which in many cases were not successfully done. In this case, you can see even the color of the stone did not match. The arches of the belfry are not Armenian, have the Islamic imprint on it. Here are some of the primitive in style, tree sculpture all around the church. In this shot to the left is the king Kakik, who had this built with the model of the church in his hand at the lower left. On the other side of the window is Jesus Christ and Gabriel, Angel Gabriel. On and on they go and have all these stories depicted. There was Adam and Eve. Here's that same side. Here's David and Goliath here on the right. Shot of the dome. A typical khachkar or cross stone above the window. Here's animals and hunters and pomegranates and grape clusters. This is, I believe, who's that? Jacob. Well, I forgot. I should know my Bible, but Isaac and Jacob, right? This is the prince of the Armenian throne. Here's the David and Goliath. Closer shot. This is Christ and the mother, and John. Here is soup. I can't read it. There is inscription next to it. I think St. George. I don't know. Jesus Christ at the bottom. There are, I should show that one. There are some very allegorical animals and birds. See on the left, with animals' head, but they are birds and mammals. I think I'm going backwards. Here's a fellow in trouble with a wild animal, with the rat. Some of the interior frescoes. This is one of the rarest churches in Turkey which hasn't been demolished deliberately, because it's a tourist on a tourist route, you know. And unfortunately, this church, and there is another one in Kars, which is closer to Armenian border. They claim, and Armenians have gone there, and foreign travelers who know about the history of Armenian architecture, Turks, official tourist guides claim this to be a Seljuk architecture. But they have been very unsuccessful in convincing the tourists, because anybody who sees this sort of a thing in a building knows it's Byzantine or early Christian. This is a very fantastic monastery. I don't have very good pictures of it, but it's hewn in the rocks on a hillside. It has 6 or 7 chapels they have just carved it out of the hill, starting from the top, making a 3-foot diameter opening, and taking inch by inch out, and they have 5 or 6 chapels that are connected, interconnected. It's just fantastic. This is from the portion of the church that, of one of the churches that protrudes out. The dome is in repair there. They have temporarily put. Here is the opening at the top, from which they have unearthed the whole chapel. Some of the Armenian church or cross stones that are on the hill, carved into the hill. This is a sideways. Here is another opening of one of the chapels from the top. The whole thing is from one piece of rock. The columns, everything. This is the exterior portion of the protruding church, a typical window with 2 cross stones and animals. And here's another small window with a little decorative elements. Here's the entry to that church. This is the cross stone, khachkar. Now, these khachkars came into existence in the 12th century and on, I should say 10th century and on. And they were markers for tombstones or for special commemorative events. And by the thousands, you find them in Armenia. More of the same in a cemetery. They are very intricately carved into these tombstones. Some of, well, I just included a few miniatures here. I took this from a show, actually. When they were showing it, I took a quick shot of it at UCLA. I will not go into detail. I think somebody else will probably. Some of the carvings sideways, I'm sorry, are in wood. It's a Bible cover. This is in metal. It's a gate. Mount Ararat. And I have some more slides. This picture, no. I took the previous one. This is from a book. As you can see, most of the slides, the color slides are mine, but the ones in the black and white are from books. These are some of the citadel walls of the Ani, city of Ani that I mentioned. Here's another church of the 11th century. As you can see, this is a famous cathedral of Ani, which has very high columns and clusters of columns and ribbed vaults, which predated Gothic architecture by 2 centuries, according to Skovsky. At the lower left is this triangular indentation in exterior walls that I showed in plan. Start of that. This is the complex of churches that were dynamited in Turkey. It's again not very well. This is that church in Kars near the Armenian border, which is now being used as a museum. It was originally as a depot since 1915. It's being shown as a Seljuk piece of architecture to tourists. This is the second period where you see the vertical dimension. Here's a monastic complex. Here is a church of Marmashin of the 11th to 13th century where we see fan-like roof. In other words, the dome is not this many-sided and it's like a fan. Here is what we call caravanserai, like a hotel of the time of the 12th century. There's a bridge of the 13th century. Again, some monastic complexes. This is interesting. Some of the monastic complexes had adjacent buildings, or prayer rooms or libraries. Instead of having columns, they would have two pairs of arches crossing each other at 90 degrees. Here you see a pair of arches coming towards you, and you see one going the other way, the other being above you. And these two pairs of arches crossing each other formed an opening at the top, which either had a dome or stayed open, like the original home. This is that Persian, Armenian church in Persia map that we're talking about, some of the free sculpture around it. This is 20th century architecture. In 1930s, there was a school of architects in Armenia which decided that they would use the native stone, tooth stone, and motifs of early Armenian architecture in their government buildings. And this is one of the government buildings. The arcades and the colonnades. And around these arcades, 3 stories high, they have this continuous trees all over. And I took some shots of it because they're very birds and again pears and pomegranates. This is their train station. Again with native stone, sideways. This is an opening in a modern monument. Again, they have these features. It's an old apartment building of early part of the century, and they have that motif again, a truncated triangular niche into the wall. Another one here. This is their depository of manuscripts, Madenataran. Again, you see 2 pairs of these truncated indentations at the main entry. The little sculpture. This is their Academy of Science building, done in the early part of the century. This is in honor of a great Armenian writer, Tuman. This is a legendary figure in our history, Sasunti Tabit, its statue near that train station. We have another version of this in copper done by an Armenian sculptor in Fresno in front of the courthouse, David of Sassoon. And they have in Armenia monuments, besides architectural monuments, statues and all over the city. And there's a place where they have famous writers and musicians. And this Gomidas Vakar, a great Armenian musician and writer on the right, Agbabian. And this is a memorial for the Armenian martyrs of the 1915 massacres in Echmiadzin, in Armenia. Then they have fountains, thus carved in stone, for the child and the grown-up. This is a very famous Armenian bard musician, Sayat Nova. This is I think the best example of contemporary architecture in Soviet Armenia. It's again based upon the Armenian dome, 12-sided in this case, and the spire. It's again in memorial of martyrs. Every April 24, we commemorate our martyrs. And inside it, there is the eternal flame. This is another memorial, not very successful, but I think I will show it to you, for the use of the stone. In this case, the region had much more reddish stones. And they have an arcade on which certain history is depicted through reliefs. And in their parks, they have, advertisements in very colorful things. This is children's park, therefore they have childlike figures. This is a mural, I should say stained glass mural of a famous Armenian painter, Saryan, Martyros Saryan, who died a few years ago. He was in his early 90s. It's on top of a stairway. Here is a young Armenian architect, his girlfriend, and a modern building going up. This is a theater building. An apartment building using stone, proof stone. An office building. This is a youth building. I don't know if it's finished. I saw it a few years ago. Here's an Armenian church. Since you were asking if Armenian churches here or elsewhere use the same idioms, they do. They try to. Hopefully they don't copy, but they use the spirit or the idioms in contemporary methods and materials. This is a very poor area in Lebanon called Anjar. Armenians who had to flee Turkey in 1930s when part of Syria, where Armenians inhabited, was given to Turkey. They were brought to this part of Lebanon by the French government. At the time, Syria being a French and Lebanon being a French mandate, and they built this concrete church with their own hands. Here's a church, contemporary Armenian church in New Jersey, using the dome as a motif and colors. Here's an Armenian church in Lebanon called Antilias, where another Catholic host resides. Here is a church in Persia being built. It's finished by now. Oh, sorry, same church. Here is a church complex that I designed for Fresno. It wasn't built. Some ideas. Here's a monument that was built in 1968 on opening day in Montebello. Again, its inspiration is from an Armenian dome in precast concrete. It's 7 feet high, and there's an appropriate plaque. This is a view from the top. Here's an Armenian church that I designed. Everything else was built except the purple church when I was invited, and the plan is contemporary, but I used an octagonal idea from historic Armenian church architecture with seats and so on, of course. And to compare, the church I designed is at the bottom, and some of the historical Armenian churches are in the dark. And upper left is St. Vartan Cathedral in New York. Now, the church that I told you had decorative elements all around it is the smallest one in the center, Akhtamar. Sketch of it, interior sketch of it. The design of the pews was again in the shape of a dome, you know, that Vera looking up toward the dome. Rendering of it, the dome, and all around the church I used this frieze of Armenian cross, Khachkar. I did base it on a Khachkar that I saw in a picture of the church of Akhtamar that I showed you pictures of, and I stylized it to make it more modern and added certain elements of it. And this is the way it looks. That's in Inglewood at the corner of Slauson and La Tierra, between La Cienega and La Brea. As you can see, it's not a copy, but certainly I think anyone who has seen an Armenian church will find some similarity. And my intention was not to depart completely from ancient Armenian architecture, yet not be a strict copyist, because I don't believe in that. And it's a compromise, really. I'm not sorry for it, but certainly if you are going to maintain your tradition, if Aaron Copland is going to write American music, it has to sound early American. Or Khachaturian, if he writes Armenian music, he's of the 20th century, he cannot write music that does not sound Armenian. So we have the same problem as contemporary architects. That's all. If you have any questions, if you have the time, otherwise, I have the time.
Any questions?
I know you.
Thank you very much.
Make sure.
So anyway, the dome is representative of Armenian architecture in the church.
It's from the outside, that's the most dominant element. And you can tell
So
it's an
even
Armenian
if today
church.
you build a church, you have to include the dome.
Almost, if you don't, you are...
You're not Armenian.
No.
Can't
Yeah.
you just put the cross up on top? Wouldn't that indicate the same thing?
No, the dome, without the dome, they won't consider an Armenian church. The parishioners or the priests.
You know, that's very unusual. I didn't know that.
It's a trademark.
Other than the trademark,
build
does it
another
have a
one.
symbolic meaning?
Well, yes, it has a symbolic meaning in the sense that it emulated the early homes they had where they had this dome with an opening at the center. And they say that they had to have a dome in the church so that they could look up to the sky, to their God. You see? Because they had no windows in their early homes. When they want to pray, they look up through that opening. And the church dome has the same function. They could not stand this, they had to have an opening.
Was it open without no? Well, they didn't have
Right.
glass in those days,
Right.
so
No.
it was just open.
Right.
They've got a new Armenian church on the free, on Hollywood Freeway.
Yeah,
as
that's
you
a
go down
congregational
Hollywood.
church.
That's Armenian, though,
That's
isn't
a
it?
main congregational church. White.
Got the dome.
Has a dome too.
Well, it was very interesting.
Is this a new book?
Yes, that's a beautiful book.
Catholic Saints.
Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the course.
Well, I'm
But I'll
glad-
spread the word.
Yeah,
I wrote
do.
down information. In case somebody lives out in that area, visit 3.3 to you. I'll send it.
Yeah, in 8 weeks, you know?
They were both delightful.
Well, I really enjoyed working with you guys.
We sure had a good time.